retired Air Force officer, an attorney with a bachelor's degree in political science and in history from Portland State University, master's degree in international relations from Oxford University, a law degree from Willamette University. He's an amateur archaeologist and has lived permanently in coastal Lakewood for the past 14 years. You may know him from his blog. How many people have seen his blog? If not, I would like to encourage him to continue. We all love it. Thank you. Here's Steve Cotton.
There you go.
Norm, am I live?
Just a second.
Yes. Okay. I wanted to start with a question. Why did you come to Mexico? Let me just pose some possibilities. Who came for the weather? Who came for the food? Who came for the people?
All the above.
What else? That's my brother, by the way, who answered free rent. Anything else? Why you came to Mexico?
Fishing.
Fishing. Music. Culture. All of those are great answers, but I noticed no one said what was my top choice. I came to Mexico because of the history, and I'll add on, and the currency. And I'd probably say that because that's the topic we're talking about today. We're going to go through the history of Mexico using the currency that's in your pocket. That'd be Norm. It's no coincidence that the Spanish word historia, when translated, has two meanings in English. The first one is obvious. Just look at it, you know what it means. It's history. But it also means story. It's the word for the tales we tell one another. And so I want you, for a moment, as we think about the banknotes, we're going to tell a story. And we're going to gather around the fireplace. Think the frost is on the wisteria. We're in your house, we're not here. We have a mug of hot chocolate with us. And we're going to sit together and share tales of our favorite tales. Now, I want everybody here to do me a favor. Take out your wallet. I know we're in a church, and if you think something's going to happen that isn't going to happen. And take out a denomination, one note for each denomination. Now, you have 6 possibilities. You can have a 20, a 50, a 100, a 200, a 500, or 1,000. And there may be different colors for each one, not colors, but different faces on each one of those. And we'll get to that in a moment. But hang on to them, and we're going to look at them. But first I want to do a couple of interesting facts about those notes. At least I find them interesting. Mexico, like a lot of countries, has chosen to differentiate its currency, not only for its citizens, but especially for tourists. So if you look at each of these notes, there's 2 things that distinguish them. The first one is size. 100 is bigger than 50, 50 is bigger than 20, so when you reach in your wallet, you can kind of feel and see which one is which. But there's another difference, and that's the color. Each of the notes has a different color. And that brings me to the second, what I consider to be an interesting fact. In 2018, the Bank of Mexico issued a new series of notes. They started with 500. They're complete with them now. But the bank created a little problem for us. It announced with the new series of notes, this note was going away, and there would be no more 20 peso notes. Instead, the bank promised it would mint more 20 peso notes, or coins. Now, I'm going to ask you, in the time you've been down, let's say in the last few months, how many of those have you received in change?
0.
Well, that's why the bank still has the 20 peso notes around, because it's a workhorse banknote. I mean, we use it a whole lot. These aren't out yet. But here's a problem. The next. The bank has two notes out that are very similar to one another. And I have seen already several people, either in change or spending themselves, use the wrong note. And they look close because both of them are blue, and they have Juarez's face on both of them. So if you were just quickly to look at it, it's easy enough to mistake a 20 for a 500. There are two clues. One of them is size. This one is much larger than a 20 peso note. And the most obvious difference is to look at it. One has a big 20 on it, the other has a big 500 on it. But until this gets out of circulation, we're going to still have the possibility of that confusion. So just watch those. But we're not here just to talk about those. We're here to talk about tales of dead people, and we'll get to that. Let me start with a tale of two men who are associated with Mexico, closely associated. That you know their names, probably everybody in the world knows their names. But neither one of them is on a banknote, and most likely never will be. This is their story. The year is 1519. Only 27 years after Columbus accidentally bumped into the Bahamas, the Spanish knew Mexico was here, but they had chosen not to explore it. They explored the islands instead in the Caribbean. But one guy decided it was time to explore Mexico. That's Hernan Cortez. Fresh from Havana, he lands on the Gulf shore near Veracruz, and marches his men inshore. He's looking for fame and fortune, land and treasure, and to save souls for their Catholic Majesties, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. His army is only 500 men. He has 13 horses, a handful of cannon, and he marches into Mexico not knowing what he's going to discover. When he lays siege to one of the greatest empires in the world, the Aztecs, who was led by this fellow, Moctezuma II. 200,000 people live in his capital city. He has thousands of warriors that have captured most of what we now know as Mexico. All of them are battle-hardened. But with his army, Cortez captures the Aztec capital city and completely destroys it, leaving it completely ruined. Moctezuma is dead. The sun sets on the Aztec Empire, and within 1 year, Cortez and his troops are on the west coast of Mexico, on the Pacific. Excuse me. Now, that story is interesting, and we all know it. But the problem is, it's not true. Well, at least it's not fully true. Because most history textbooks include that, but there's far more to it. Before Cortez got here, this was not an unpeopled land. There were 20,000 years of history of people living in Mexico before the Spanish showed up here. And they had some of the greatest civilizations in the world. These pictures like these, let us know, this is a reconstruction, obviously. There were cities here in Mexico that were far grander than anything that existed in Europe at the time of the invasion. These cities were built about the time ancient Egypt, ancient Babylonia, the Roman Empire existed. And we know that they existed because we can still go visit them today. If you go up into the highlands of Mexico, you can visit all of these, of what's left of these grand cities that were built up before the Europeans arrived. When the French and Germans and British were stirring sticks or mud with sticks, these cities were existing here. Now, the civilizations that existed here didn't have just magnificent architecture. They invented the concept of zero, which was a big invention for humanity. They also had calculations with the seasons and calendars, where they could predict how the seasons were going to come and when it would be fruitful to plant things, especially corn. Corn or tomatoes, long chilies, every one of these three came from Mexico. They were domesticated by the people who were here before Cortez arrived. Now, there's a nice tale of how all three of these items were spread around the world by the Portuguese, but we can leave that for later. But things that, for instance, we often think of Thai chilies as being from Thailand. They're not. They came from here. From chilies in India were developed from chilies that came from Mexico. Let me mention one civilization that existed around here. It's called the shaft tomb tradition. And it existed from here up to the highlands. Now, most of them were nomadic, but they built shaft tombs, which is the name for the civilization, that were burial rites, and a lot of the things we know about this culture come from those tombs. But if you go up to Guadalajara, just on the outskirts of Guadalajara, is what I find one of the most interesting reconstructions now. It took the primitive side of the shaft tomb culture and took all the concepts and built them into these mounds. I would, if you have time, or if you have people who come in to visit here, don't take them to the Yucatan to see all the Maya ruins. You don't need to. Go up to the Colima State Museum. Go to just outside of Guadalajara, and there are great things. There are tours from here that will take you there, and you can learn a little bit of what existed before Cortez showed up. Now, when Cortez arrived, there were about 150 tribes here in Mexico, with a population of 25 million people. About the same number of people who live in modern Texas, or 3 times as the number who live in Quebec. But the most powerful tribe in 1519 were a group who had recently arrived from the north, the Mixteca, the Aztecs. Their tribal name is
Power away now.
well, we can do it. We're a can-do group. The Mixteca is where Mexico gets its name. And they were a group that had come from the north, and in about 150 years had created a greater empire, probably even greater than the Maya. And that is what Cortez saw when he came. The city we saw briefly up here, when Cortez came through the mountain passes to come into the highlands of Mexico, they were awed about what they saw. There was nothing in Europe that looked like that. Certainly nothing in Spain at the time. And the question always comes up at this point, how on earth did Cortez, with 500 men and just a few horses, handle 25 million Indians? I mean, how did he conquer 25 million Indians in Mexico? And the answer is, of course, there was no such thing as 25 million Indians. They were members of tribes, and they were tribes that had spent time fighting one another and contesting one another. That's how the Aztecs came in power. They used the divide and conquer technique. Well, Cortez and his men were not the people who captured and overthrew the Aztecs. There was a tribe called the Tlaxcala who existed just outside of Mexico. They had been defeated by the Aztecs. They were sworn enemies of them because, as part of their tribute, the tribe had to provide sacrifices each year to the Aztecs. As I often say, the Tlaxcans saw a good deal that they knew how to get over because their heart was in it. I apologize. So that's what happened. It was this division. Cortez used that with building up with other tribes around. And at the end, when the Aztecs fell, the other tribes were watching expectantly of what was going to happen. And what happened next was worse than they could have imagined. Because those 25 million Indians I talked about who were here when Cortez arrived, let me ask you, just to a guess, in 20 years, how many of those Indians were still alive? Take a guess. Well, some were.
10%.
Even more than that. 95% were dead. 1 million survived. And I heard one of the answers over here. 3 things did it. There was warfare. A lot of them died in war. The second one was slave labor, because Cortez immediately put the Indians to work in slavery. And then the third thing was disease. He had an ally in smallpox. And it didn't just affect here. It's amazing how fast smallpox spread through the Americas. By the time Pizarro got to Peru, to the Inca Empire, the same question comes up. How did a few men destroy the Inca Empire? Well, a few men didn't destroy the Inca Empire. Civil War and smallpox. Before he got there, before the Spanish got to Peru, smallpox beat him. And it was devastating in this world. Let's see. Does anyone have one of the new 50 peso notes? It's a kind of a bluish color. I don't have an 8 of that, but it celebrates. It's the one new bill that celebrates the power of the Aztecs, and it's an interesting bill. I don't see it very often. I still see the old 50 instead. But there's an old bill which is kind of a reddish color. It's this bill right here on this pillar. Does anybody have one of those? Take a look at the front of that. What can you tell me about the person on the front? Male or female? Oh, that's 50. The 100 is what we're after. Male or female? He's male. What would you say of his ancestry? Is he British? What would be your guess? He's an Indian. Yes, but he is not an Aztec. He lived during the time of the Aztec, and he was the leader of Tlaxco, which was the second largest city in the empire. But that's not the whole reason why he's there. And I really like Mexican currency for this reason. They've taken a diverse group of people and put them on their notes. If you will look up in the corner up here, there's some small writing, and I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts, which isn't even an even bet, that you can't read it. But it's one of his poems. And here's how the poem goes. I love the song of the mockingbird, bird of 400 voices. I love the color of jade and the intoxicating scent of flowers. But more than all, I love my brother, man. Now, it's interesting that this poet never got to meet Cortez. He died before Cortez arrived. I'm not sure what poem he would have written following meeting Cortez. But when they arrived, the Aztec were at the top of their game. And at the end, only 1 million of the original Indians were still alive. as we go into the colonial period. Mexico became a very important part of Spain's colonial empire, mainly for the resources. There was gold, silver here. As it turned out, the silver mines of Peru and Mexico ruined the economy of Spain. You would think that they would have become far richer, but it completely inflated their currency out of whack. And it was one of the reasons that the great Spanish Empire eventually fell, is because of but they liked it at the time, when it was going. Of course, a lot of colonists came over to Mexico. Because they were Spanish, they brought along with them their culture. And if you go up to places like San Miguel de Allende or Pátzcuaro, you can look around and see the architecture, and you could feel like you're in a small town outside of Madrid. The government buildings, the churches, the plazas, they were all designed around that concept. But not everything good came from Spain. One of the negative things that happened, well, let me stop for 1 second. Where is my favorite woman? Ah, there she is. Back there, the 200 peso note, the green. Does anybody have one? A green 200 peso note? Look at the front of it. What do you notice about her? First of all, she's a woman. What would you guess about her vocation?
She looks like a nun.
She is a nun. And her name is, she's also on the new 100. Her name is Juana Inés de Cruz. And if any of you have ever taken a Spanish literature course, you will have read her works, because she is, especially her poetry, she is acclaimed as one of the great authors of the golden age of Spanish literature, along with Cervantes. She is an interesting choice to be on a banknote. If you were to think of colonial Spain, would you think of a woman as being the symbol of colonial Spain? And in most cases, the answer would be no, because women in the 16th or 17th century in Mexico and in Spain did not have much political power. But she's an interesting choice, and because of who she is. First of all, as I said, she's a woman. The second thing is she was born illegitimate. And in the upper crust of Spanish culture, she's got two things going from her right off, two bad things going for her right off the bat. She had one leg up. Her mother's family was extremely wealthy. Her grandfather owned a hacienda that had one of the largest libraries in Mexico. This young girl learned to read and write Latin by the time she was 3. She composed music. By 8, she was writing poetry. In her teens, she was known as a philosopher. She even learned to speak and write Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Excuse me a moment. I'll put my face back on. The chief road for a woman in colonial Spain to get ahead was usually just one route. Guess what it is? Marriage. But Juana Inés was not really very good marriage material in the 17th century. One thing was her birth, being illegitimate. But she was extremely smart. She did not mind letting people know her intelligence. And it didn't really make her number one on the let's get married. She was smarter than almost any men she ever encountered. For a brief period of time, she was a lady-in-waiting to the wife of the viceroy of Mexico. And she had lots of proposals because of her position there, and she turned them all down. She just didn't want to be a bride. So she decided to take the only route that was left to her, and she became a bride of Jesus instead, and joined the convent. And not just joined the convent. She set up a salon in the convent. She had all the intellectuals from Mexico City would come down and they would have meetings and they'd discuss things, listen to her music that she had composed. Until, well, let's take a look at some. Now, I do this in Spanish, but we'll just do it in English. If you look on the 200, there's just like on the 100 with the poetry. It's
The other 200.
we're up there, right under Banco de Mexico, is a poem which translates to this. O foolish men who accuse women with so little cause, not seeing you are the reason for the very thing you blame. Now, the church did not mind that she was intelligent, and that she wrote about feminism, and that she wrote about some rather dicey and controversial theology. They even closed their eyes to her rather explicit lesbian poetry. But this was not going to stand. She was calling the men of the church hypocrites for something that they had created themselves. That was the end of her salon. The bishop went to her, took her instruments, her musical instruments, her scientific instruments, her entire library, and she was shut down. For the next year, she ended up tending her fellow nuns who had come down with the plague. She got the plague, and she died, and it was the end of what I consider to be one of the most extraordinary women on these banknotes. She was one of the exceptions in the colonial period. She was somebody who made her own life and made her own exception. But there was a bigger problem going on as well in Mexican society. There were two groups of people who were essentially in charge in Mexico. The first group were Spanish blood people who had been born in Spain and had come to Mexico. The second group were Spanish blood who were born here, and they were called Creoles. And they were in second place to the people who came from Spain. The Spanish men who were born in Spain had won the social lottery. They could get any job for which they either had connections or were qualified for. If the same man had been born in Mexico, he could get into things. He could be a priest, but he couldn't be a bishop. He could be in the army, but he couldn't be a general. He could be in government, but he could never be a minister or in control of things. And that chafed over a period of time. And it went on up until 1810, when certain historical facts started happening, and Mexico was ripe for its own, we've had enough from Spain. And what broke out was the War of Independence. Ironically, considering the role that France is about to play in Mexico's history in our little timeline, it was the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte who caused the War of Independence to break out, because he invaded Spain and put his brother on the throne. Now, that didn't go well with people here who were even loyal to the crown in Spain. And the Criollos, who wanted to have independence, decided, if we say we're in favor of putting the king back on the throne, we won't be traitors. We'll be supporting the old ways. And that's exactly how the war started out. That it was going to be some kind of federation with Spain as opposed to being completely independent of Spain. Does anybody have one of the new 200 peso notes? Well, see the two guys up here? They were the two leaders of the first part of the War of Independence from Spain. On the left is Miguel Hidalgo, and on the right is Morelos. And let's take a look first at Miguel Hidalgo. He's on the new 1,000, or that's the old 1,000 peso note. He's an interesting guy, and really a very improbable political hero. He's a Criollo. He decided to take the church road to success, so he'd at least have some advancement that he could make. And things seemed to be going well for him. He became dean of the law school in Morelia, and that unfortunately didn't last long because he was a reformist at heart and he wanted to change the curriculum. And academic types don't really like having their curriculum changed on them. And as often happens with people who are trying to reform, there were some accusations about financial problems. So the bishop ousted him and said, we're going to send you up the road to Dolores, which is a small village in Guanajuato. There were other things that were going on as well. He ran afoul of the Inquisition because he wasn't really very good with that vow of chastity. With 4 different women, he had what I refer to as a brood of Hidalgo children. But off he goes. And he took his reforming ways up there to Dolores. He had the indigenous folks plant olives and grapes because that was a monopoly that existed in Spain. It was illegal to grow olives and grapes here, or wine grapes. That eventually got shut down. The church said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. And he tried some other reforms with vocation with the indigenous people as well. Put an end to that. And finally, Hidalgo had had enough. Along comes Napoleon Bonaparte and he says, we have our opportunity. So he met with some people up in San Miguel de Allende, or as it was known then, San Miguel. And they planned a war. But somebody tipped them off, as often happens. And on the morning of 10, go ahead, one more. Oops, back one. One. There. On the morning of 16 September 1810, the bells rang out in Dolores, and the parishioners were called, and Hidalgo issued what is called El Grito de Dolores, the scream, the call of Dolores, calling the people together and saying, we are going to have independence. And he ended up this rousing speech with death to the Spaniards. Now, you can hear this same speech, and, next one. See the bell up there? Every little town hall here in Mexico has a similar bell that is rung on the night of 15 September at midnight. And the El Grito, minus the death to the Spaniards, because, there might be some tourists in town, is given, and everybody shouts after every line, what? Viva Mexico! Viva Mexico! So off they go, and we're at war. The problem is, all this well-planned, we're not going to have a real uprising, we want to have a federated Mexico, immediately turns into an insurrection. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are an Indian who's been ministered to by Hidalgo. My family has spent now 300 years being oppressed by all kinds of nonsense. And how do you think you're going to feel when given the opportunity to get death to the Spanish? That's exactly what happened. They marched on Guanajuato, and perhaps one of the most horrifying massacres of this War of Independence happened in Guanajuato, in a granary. All of the Spanish, men, women, and children, went there for refuge. The doors were burned down, and nobody inside was left alive. Hidalgo was scandalized. This isn't what he had signed up for. What he had hoped for was it was going to be an easy transition to a change in Mexico. He was not really a very good military commander. So he takes his mob at this point, and some soldiers which have signed up. They're headed to Mexico City, and for some inexplicable reason, Hidalgo changes his mind. And they were on a roll. Nobody was ready for them to get to Mexico City. But Hidalgo wasn't going to let Guanajuato happen over. He retreats to Guadalajara. Of course, now the Spanish troops, en masse, they go to Guadalajara, and the 4 leaders of the insurrection disappear. Every one of them is captured. They're put before a firing squad. They are beheaded, and the heads are hung on each of the corner of the granary. Remember I told you with the granary where people were massacred? Their heads remained on those corners for 10 years until the war was over. That wasn't the end. The leadership now moves from Hidalgo to this man. If you take out a 50 peso note, the one I saw several of you had those out. Then it's Morelos. He was also a priest, but there's something different about him. He's mestizo. He wasn't a European white born in Mexico. He was a mixture of Indian and Spanish blood. But he was very good at what he did. He was also a priest. He had some trouble with his chastity vows as well, but he fought very successfully for several more years. But on 1815, he was captured and stood before a firing squad. So we go from 1810 to 1815, not much has changed. And for another 6 years, the war simply kind of floats along like a lot of insurgencies do. Up until one point, and a very unlikely man comes on the scene. He's not Mexican in any way. I was going to point out, in addition to being on the notes, Morelos is also on an island. That statue is huge. It's like climbing up inside the Statue of Liberty. You can go up in the top and peer out of his eyes. It's a perfect example of socialist realism art. It's not very pretty, but it's a nice thing. Next one, please. This is the guy that comes along. Now you know, anybody who dresses in Mexico like that probably doesn't have a good future in front of him. His name is Agustin Iturbide. And as I said, he's not Mexican. He was Spanish-born and is commander of the Spanish army in Mexico, one section at a time. Brutal man, absolutely brutal. In revenge for what happened at the granary, he several times over took revenge on behalf of Spain. But he decided this has gone on long enough. Now, what was happening back in Spain is Napoleon's gone, and the king has been returned, but there's a liberal government that's come into place in Spain, and it looks like the king is going to be asked to leave. So Iturbide decides, hey guys, let's get together. We can invite the king here, he can be our king, and we can stop this silly war. They agreed. And Iturbide comes into Mexico City. The war is over. They invite the king to come. He said, nah, not interested. Don't want to be the king of Mexico. So Iturbide gets himself named the regent. That lasts for a couple of months until they get the final answer from the king. And then he decides he's going to be Emperor Augustine instead. He's going to be the first non-indigenous Mexican emperor. It didn't last long. He was emperor for about 1 year. He was overthrown. Some other steps happened, but eventually he ends up, like a lot of people do in Mexico who try to lead things. And this is what happened to Iturbide. He came back and was executed by a firing squad. Don't wear those kind of clothes. I used to say, because of this firing squad and all the other stuff that happened with Iturbide, you would never see him on a banknote. And I should learn my lesson that I don't take into account that Mexico sometimes likes its villains. Because just recently, you probably won't see very many of these. This is a commemorative note. And remember, I told you the 20 notes were supposed to be withdrawn? Well, lo and behold, we get a new one. There were just a few of those printed. And you can barely see him. If you have one of those notes, you almost need a magnifying glass. This is as far as Iturbide gets credit for. That's him on the horse up there. But I'm never going to say again, you're not going to see somebody on the banknote. Well, with the exception of one guy, we'll come to him in a moment. And then post-independence comes along. Between 1821 and 1857, Mexico was not well served. As you can imagine, anytime a war goes on for 11 years in your country, there's still two sides. It's like a civil war. And people were not getting along with one another. There were wars that took place, but one of the worst things externally was what happened with this map. In those years, first of all, Mexico lost all of Central America. And for those of you who didn't know, Central America was part of the Mexico when it was in its colonial period. The first year of independence, they said, we don't want to be here. Yucatan went into revolt, and Yucatan was almost lost. Texas was lost. California was lost. The northwest of Mexico was lost. At the same time of the Texas Rebellion, these two states right here, anyway, those two states went into revolt as well, but they were kept within Mexico. And the state of Zacatecas went into rebellion, but it was held. By the time we get to 1859, half of Mexico is no longer Mexico. But there was also a lot of dispute that was going on socially. There was a major political split between conservatives, and they looked back to Spain for their, in Europe, for their political inspiration. They favored a strong central government. And then there were the liberals, who looked to the United States and to something of a mythical Aztec past for their politics. And they favored decentralization. Should say they favored decentralization when they weren't in power. And each group argued their position was the true Mexican identity. They were not merely intellectual. This last part between the conservatives and the liberals broke out in the War of Reforma. Now, if you've ever wondered how the street out here got its name, Reforma, it's from this movement. So this turned from a political dispute in Congress to people dying in the streets. One of the goals of the conquest had been to convert the natives to Catholicism. And in the process, like other Spaniards, the church became quite wealthy. Not only with its schools and its churches and the convents, but income-producing property. We don't know exactly, but the estimate is 25 to 40% of the income-producing property in Mexico was owned by the church in 1859. The reformists, of course, wanted land reform. They wanted to get land to the peasants to let them have an ability to raise crops and the like. And the church became the prime target. And that's when one of the most unusual men in Mexico comes on the scene. I would say he's probably Mexico's most loved figure, well known outside of Mexico. He was the leader of the liberals. Mexico's first and only full-blooded Indian president, Benito Juarez. There are two bills that have Juarez on their face. This is the new 500, the confusing one. And the other one is this, as we all know, the other confusing bill right now. Juarez is one of Mexico's Horatio Alger stories. He was born poor, as I pointed out, even in the mid-1800s. An Indian in Mexico getting a position was just not heard of. It was very, very rare. He was lucky. He worked for a Franciscan priest who saw that this young man was really intelligent. And he gave him every break in the world, sent him off to law school, became a lawyer, and then went into politics, eventually ending up on the Mexican Supreme Court as Chief Justice. Well, just at the time he became Chief Justice in 1858, President Comonfort, there was big disputes going on. He said, I've had it, I'm not going to be president anymore, I don't want to wear clothes like Peter Beebe. Back one. He then, because the way the Constitution was set up, he went from Chief Justice to President. And he was elected to the job 3 times. He had some rocky terms in office because this guy shows up in Mexico. And as I said, here we go, people dressing in fancy clothes, you're not going to come to a good end. This is Maximilian, or Maximilian, as some of us know him. The French decided, because the Mexicans owed them some debts, the best way to pay those debts is to take control of the country. It's sort of like a foreclosure. And so they sent this Austrian Archduke, a Habsburg, to be the Emperor of Mexico. He's welcomed by the conservatives because he's everything they want. If you recall, the people who wanted King Ferdinand to come back when the independence was over, some of them are still sticking around. They'll say, we'll take a Habsburg prince instead. There was a huge war that broke out, the war of the French incursion. Which brings us to what another one of Mexico's interesting characters. You probably don't have one of his notes. He's this guy. Anybody have one of these notes? This was the 500 peso note when I moved down. It's Ignacio Zaragoza. And you probably know more about this note than a lot of the others, and we'll get to why. He served in Benito Juarez's cabinet, and then when the French invaded, he went off as a general to defend his country. And he decided to defend it in a very important place, in Puebla. The French marched on 2 forts in Puebla, and I will have to say, perhaps with the worst military tactics anyone has ever come upon. But Zaragoza was a great general. With a handful of men, he completely defeated the French in one of Mexico's greatest military victories. And it happened on what day? Well, English first. The 5th of May, and yeah, Cinco de Mayo. Now, Cinco de Mayo is not a big holiday here. In fact, it's a far better holiday up north. In the city of Puebla, it's a huge holiday because it happened there. But Zaragoza was kind of like one of those characters from Greek tragedy. He didn't live long enough to see bad things happen in his life after the war. He died of typhus soon after the battle took place. One of the other myths about this day is that it's the 4th of July for Mexico? Is it? Is it Independence Day in Mexico? We already know that date. What is it? Let's put it up. It's 16 September. So Cinco de Mayo is during the War of French incursion. This is independence, the Declaration of Independence in Mexico. Events in Europe eventually made the French emperor withdraw his troops from Mexico, leaving Maximilian and his conservative generals on their own. Juarez defeated them soundly. And as happens with people who dress in fancy clothes in Mexico, he was put in front of a firing squad with his two main generals and executed. Interestingly enough, when we think this is 1863, that's a photograph. That's an actual photograph of Maximilian's death. Juarez probably stayed in office, as often people do, too long. He thought because there was a tradition of only serving one term in office. And he thought because his terms had been interrupted by the War of Reforma, by the French incursion, that he should stay in office. A young general who just happened to have been at the Battle of Puebla decided this isn't right. Juarez has to go, and he rose in revolt. Juarez won, but the next year he died. And from here on out, we are going to, that young man, that young general, will become president of Mexico, and for this entire era will be known by his name, the Porfiano. At the time Juarez died, Mexico was in worse economic shape than it was in 1821 when they had gained independence from Spain. And it's obvious why. I mean, all those wars, the loss of a good deal of their territory, had left the country really down. Porfirio Diaz ran for office, and it made on this platform. Well, that's him. You think you know how he's going to end up because I've given too many hints, but we'll find out, won't we? He ran on this platform. Peace, order, prosperity. Now imagine you're a Mexican who for almost 100 years had been living in a shattered society. That's going to sound great. He turned out to be the longest running, essentially authoritarian dictator of Mexico since 1519. But one thing that did happen is prosperity did come to Mexico, and it came at a terrible cost. The Industrial Revolution took place. The whole setup in Mexico it was no longer only an agrarian economy. It became a manufacturing center. There were Canadian mines, American railroads, British investment. The whole country was operating on foreign capital, and it looked like outsiders ran the country. That was one of the reasons why at the end of 1910, people were ready for a change. They had prosperity, but it was held by a few people, not very many. And the country was becoming more of a world power, but it just wasn't what most people wanted. So a very odd event happened in 1910. President Porfirio Diaz decided to give his greatest gift to Mexico, which was a revolution. It started strange. Most revolutions do. Most of these events seem to start with something small. Porfirio Diaz in 1910 sat down with the New York Times and said, I've been president long enough. I don't think I want to run this year, so I'm going to let somebody else do it. Next slide, please. Oh, back. Sorry. And so he said, let somebody else do it. And the war ended up breaking out. Let's see. Yeah. Next one, Norm. This is what happened during the revolution. Mexico had a population of 15 million people. Out of that, 1 million people died during the years of the revolution. It is known as the turning point in Mexican history. It's probably the biggest event that happened in Mexico. What happened before revolution and what happened after revolution are two different Mexicos. But look at that 15 million people. We're talking about 1910. Just Indians who lived in Mexico in 1519. How many of those were there? 25 million. Between the time of 1519 and at the start of the revolution, Mexico had only built its population back to this point. I mean, that's with all kinds of immigration and 4 centuries of populating the normal way. It was but as I say, what Porfirio Diaz gave was the revolution. He said he wasn't going to seek re-election. And a young man from up north, Madero, said, well, I think I'd make a good president. So he said, I'm going to run. I'll volunteer. Porfirio Diaz said, no, that's not a good idea. I think you'd make a lot better prisoner than a president. And because you're in prison, I'm going to run again. And he did, and it was so fraudulently or transparently fraudulent that people said, that's it. Now, for all those other bad things that had happened, it's a very small event, you would think, that triggers it. But he asking for re-election, in fact, that was one of the slogans of the revolution immediately was, no re-election. And so the revolution breaks out. We already saw, we see what the result is. But there are things that are far more important than that. Now let's look, see if we have that bill up here. That's President Madero on the far right there. The other two women were also very important in the revolution. One of them, let's see if I can find her name here. It just escaped me again. Hi. Yeah, it is. My eyesight won't do it. Anyway, I'm sorry. It's gone. One is a feminist writer, the woman in the middle, who was quite well known in Mexico literature, and the other was a revolutionary activist. I want to spend a little bit of time on Madero, however. He led the revolution. There was then an election. He's elected president. And you would think it would all end well because he's not wearing any of that funny, fancy clothing. But this is a story that happens during the revolution for about the next 19 years. Leaders will come to power and be gone. Madero was arrested by one of his generals. He and his vice president were taken to prison, and as the old line went, they were shot while trying to escape. So a general comes to power. Another general says, I'm not going to stand for this. And he sends the other guy off into exile and becomes president himself. It's the other bill that comes from the revolution. And you may not have one of these. It's a commemorative bill. See the guy who looks like he's doing the Colonel Sanders impression with the white beard? President Carranza, General Carranza. He becomes president. And for a while, there is stability. There is still big dispute in the revolution between people who want more land reform, people who want less land reform, people who want, all kinds of things, all kinds of political things, and there's disputes. He finally orders a convention to be held in 1917, and as a result of that, the Constitution of 1917 is enacted. It's the Constitution that's still in effect. And even though Carranza was not really happy with it because it was far more liberal than what he had initially proposed, It is a pretty good statement of what most of the leaders of the revolution wanted, and it's still with us today. The big things that happened during that time, there were three things, and that was to get foreigners out of political and economic influence in Mexico. Those Canadian mines, American railroads, British investment, they were done. They were confiscated. Nobody was compensated for them. You're just gone, and you're lucky you're still alive. The other thing was to strip the Catholic Church of all its property. I mentioned this earlier, that during Juarez's time, all the income-producing property generally had been stripped from the church. The revolution said, that's not enough. The churches don't belong to you, the convents don't belong to you, they belong to the state. And here's what the Constitution, some of the provisions of the Constitution of 1970. I'm not going through far, I just picked some of them. It restricted the participation in political affairs of all foreigners. And that means raising money for local political candidates. It's a deportable offense. All contracts are presumed to have a national benefit in them, and if the national benefit isn't apparent, it will be imposed by the Constitution. What that means is everything in the economy in Mexico was designed to benefit the goals of the revolution. Established a system of free, mandatory, and secular education, which was new. And the group that was doing that before, of course, was the church. Their schools were closed down. Public schools were in effect. It set up foundations for land reform through the ejido system. I know a lot of us run into that when we're trying to buy land here. Declared all mineral resources belong to the state and not to foreigners. Provided for labor rights. Placed ownership of all property in the hands of state. And restricted ownership along the border and along the coastline to make foreigners ineligible from buying property. Now, how many of you hold property here through a bank trust? When we do the real estate course here, you may want to ask the presenter, first of all, the Constitution was never changed. It's still restricted and prohibited. We hold through a statute, and it says that in 100 years, that goes away. And no one knows the answer to that question. When I raised that question with my attorney, he said, "You expect to be here?" And my answer was no. But nobody really knows the answer unless something changes. It increased restrictions on the Catholic Church of how the priests could be seen in public, empowered the government to expropriate property at any time. In theory, in fact, the Constitution starts, all property of Mexico belongs to the state. Now, you might think that that was some revolutionary socialist idea. It's actually a royal idea from Spain, because everything in Mexico, before the king was kicked out, who owned it? The king. None of the people of Mexico owned it. It prohibited the re-election of any officials. I pointed out that was one of the main reasons for the revolution. And that just changed in this last election cycle. Every office can now be re-elected with the exception of one. Do you want to take a guess what that is? The president. The president has no right to be re-elected. And it guaranteed the rights to own, for persons in Mexico to own firearms in their home. Now, Carranza was also responsible for the death of several of the other leaders, including Emiliano Zapata. And it's probably not less than ironic that he was killed by the army as well in another one of the many coups that happened in Mexico. The Mexico of 1929, once the revolution was done in its entirety, was a much, much different world than before the revolution began. But that brings us now to contemporary Mexico, where we are today. The revolution succeeded in a very great extent because the Mexico of 2023 is even much different than the Mexico of 1929. The country has been blessed with natural resources, which have been a boon. The discovery of large petroleum resources changed Mexico greatly in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And then NAFTA, the NAFTA process, turned Mexico into one of the world's, this hemisphere's, great manufacturers. You may not know this, but Mexico is the largest producers of auto parts in the world. And I saw a site on this, I think it's number 3 in airplane seats. Kind of a niche market, but it's the kind of things that people usually don't think about with Mexico. I often hear people referring to Mexico as a third world country. That is not only an anachronism, it's a canard. Because Mexico is no third world country. Oh, excuse me. I nearly went past it. I often, because it is the 12th to 15th largest economy in the world, has the 10th largest population in the world. It's a member of the OECD, and if you don't know what the OECD is, it's the rich country club, economic club. And the United Nations classified them as a middle-income country. Nothing can be further from the truth that Mexico is some kind of third world country. But Mexico is not only about money, and your answers, and we started certainly pointing that out, because here's an example of it. The 500 peso note, the old 500 peso note. Who are they? Diego Garcia and?
No, Rivera.
Frida Rivera.
No.
How are they related?
Frida Kahlo. Diego.
Oh, what did I say? Oh, I made them married. There you go. How are they related?
They're my marriage.
A very tempestuous marriage, I might say. Why are they on the bills? What's the honor for them? Why does Mexico think these people deserve to be on our banknotes? What was he? What kind of an artist? A muralist. In fact, he was a pioneer in Mexican muralism. There were 4 great muralists. He was one of them. He kind of caved into the political groups more than the others. And there are people, but why Frida? What's Frida doing there? Nancy.
Frida's the only woman, Mexican woman, in the Louvre. There are no other Mexican men.
There are many people who would say Frida Kahlo is a better artist than her husband.
She was.
I happen to be one of those. If you have not been there, go to Mexico City, go to Frida's house, go to see the murals in all the great public buildings that were painted by Diego. I'm not a really big fan of his, but they are amazing just with their monumentals. I mean, you can look at these things and they just have a power. Then there is one more note. If you look in your wallet and you look at the bank, you will not find this note anywhere. The Bank of Mexico, when it announced the new series, said there might be a 2,000 peso note. That was back in 2018. Since then, there's been a nasty little bout of money supply inflation. And the bank is thinking in the near future of issuing these. I'm looking forward to it, not only because I get to talk about them, but see the gentleman on the far right? Does anybody know who that is? It's Octavio Paz. I believe he's the greatest writer in Mexico. He's dead now. But if none of you have read the Solitude, the Labyrinth of Solitude. You should. It is next to impossible to understand Mexico without reading that book. And I would highly, highly recommend it. I look forward to seeing this bill show up because it may mean sometime in the future, maybe 10 years from now, we're all going to have an opportunity to sit down together in front of that fireplace and tell tales of dead kings or guys who dress up like kings. And it'll give me an opportunity to once again see you folks and talk with you. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain them. There are microphones at the back.
I'll stand at this microphone so that if anybody that would like to ask a question, I'll be here. There's another microphone over there.
Who's the lady?
One moment. I wasn't going to slight her. Her name is Rosario Castellanos. She was a Mexican feminist pioneer. Her writings are not as well known as those of Octavio Paz, but they're very influential in Mexico.
Have you seen that app that they produced? Do you know anything about it? For the money that you remember seeing this app that the Mexican
From the Bank of Mexico?
Yeah.
An app from the Bank of Mexico. I'm not sure I have. Does it do the sizes and the colors? And
Well, it animates the money, and I've been told that it was for counterfeiting. The show was.
Oh, yeah, I take that back. Yes, I have. And if you go to the Bank of Mexico site on the internet itself, it will show you what to look for on each one of them of all the counterfeiting. I didn't have time to talk about that. But if you look at all the bills, you can tell there's something going on with them, with holograms and special printing and thread, just like the currency in the United States and Canada.
Right, but this app, you haven't never seen the app then?
I probably have not.
Yeah, so try it.
Okay. Thank you. Yes and no. But the question is, were they printed here in Mexico? For a while, the polymer bills were printed in Canada. Canada was printing a lot of polymer bills for a number of countries. I think they've stopped doing that now, and I'm not sure where they're being printed.
Go ahead, Al, you're going to have to take.
But we'll see one less. There will be no more 20s. I will be dead.
Go up there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Today, I just want to remind everybody before you leave that the next Thursday is going to be about rituals and custom. Anyway,
Just turn the, use Steve's mic. You would go mic. Turn Steve's mic. Steve's mic. Just for the video. I know it's.
anyway, we would like to thank you all for coming. And on the way out, we don't take up pass a plate here, but there is a free will offering on the way out. And there's also cards that we have made up. So you'll be able to see the schedule on there, and you can download or just go to the website, coastalegrecommunitychurch.com.next, and you'll be able to get all the information. And it has the whole schedule of the presentations we're going to have between now and the end of February. And like I said, the next one is on rituals and customs next week. So please take a card. You can look up the schedule. Oh, yes. The money goes, this night, the money goes to community service. Usually we divide it 50-50 between the presenter and the community service fund, which is a way of us just reaching out to the community and feeding them, looking after disaster relief and that kind of stuff at the church. So anyway, thank you to Steve Cotton for coming, and thank you guys.